Nokia lost $250 billion and the entire phone industry in about 6 years, and the strangest part is that its own engineers saw all of it coming. This is not the story of a company that fell asleep. Nokia had touchscreen prototypes before the iPhone existed, shipped a Linux-powered internet tablet in 2005, and was outspending Apple on research the whole way down. Nearly every piece of the future was sitting in its own labs, and it still lost totally and permanently to companies that spent less money and knew less about phones. So the real question was never why Nokia went blind. It is why a company that could see the future and outspend everyone chasing it still could not get there. The answer is buried in an operating system designed in the 1990s for a machine that was about to stop existing. Remember how total this was. In late 2007, Nokia sold roughly 40% of every mobile phone on Earth, and about half of all smartphones. In Finland, it was less a company than a climate, around 4% of the nation's economy and most of the Helsinki stock market. And the hardware was absurdly good. Nokia phones survived drops that shattered other handsets, held a charge for a week, and found a signal where nothing else could. You can probably still hear the ringtone and still see Snake crawling around that tiny screen. None of that was marketing, it was engineering. And the exact engineering that earned it is what killed the company. Symbian, the operating system inside those phones, did not begin life on a phone at all. It descended from Epoch, written by a British company called Symbian in the 1990s for pocket organizers, machines with a few megabytes of memory and batteries that had to survive weeks on a pair of AAs. In 1998, Symbian's software arm became Symbian Limited, jointly owned with Ericsson, Motorola and Nokia, and that pocket organizer code became the brain of the mobile industry. Everything strange about Symbian flows from that origin. Because memory was precious, it did not use ordinary text strings, it used a custom construct called a descriptor, which tracked its own length so it could never waste a byte. Because crashes were unacceptable and error handling costs memory, it dropped standard C++ exceptions for a hand-managed structure called the cleanup stack, which developers had to push and pop by hand correctly every single time. Because threads burn battery, it routed work through active objects instead. Every one of those was a smart, deliberate trade, and together they are exactly why those phones never crashed and ran for a week. But each trick pushed complexity out of the machine and into the human writing code for it, and that bill went to developers. Building even a simple app meant mastering idioms that existed nowhere else in software and punished small mistakes brutally. Through the early 2000s, none of that mattered. A phone was a phone. It made calls, sent texts, and played Snake. Nobody bought a Nokia for its app catalog because there was no app catalog and no reason to want one. Optimizing against developer convenience was not merely defensible in 2003, it was obviously correct. And it stayed correct right up until the industry started keeping score a different way. That was 2007, and the thing that changed was not really the touchscreen. Memory got cheap, and processors got fast. The scarcity Symbian's whole architecture had been bent around simply evaporated, and when a constraint disappears, every optimization built to serve it turns from an advantage into a tax you are still paying. Look at what Apple shipped. The iPhone did not run a lean, memory-starved phone operating system. It ran a stripped-down descendant of OS X, a full desktop operating system with real memory management and a real browser engine crammed onto a phone. By Symbian standards, it was wasteful and enormous. It was also, for a developer, completely ordinary. So when the App Store opened in 2008 and Android arrived with Java, an entire generation of developers could build for those platforms almost immediately without learning a private dialect invented for a pocket organizer. Nokia kept winning on everything Symbian was optimized for: battery, durability, signal, price. While the war moved to the one battlefield its architecture was built to lose, how many people outside the company would write software for it? Then Nokia's own structure made it worse. There was never really one Symbian. The platform split into competing interface layers: S60 at Nokia, UIQ at Sony Ericsson, and Motorola, a Japan-only variant. and apps written for one would not run on the others. Worse, Nokia forked Symbian internally across its own product line, so an app built for one Nokia smartphone would not necessarily run on a different Nokia smartphone. Developers had to port their work again for each variation and absorb the cost every time. By 2010, an iPhone owner was roughly 10 times more likely to download an app than a Symbian owner. Nokia had the users, Apple had the developers. Only one of those compounds. Here is the part almost nobody says out loud, and it is the number that reframes everything. Nokia was not outspent. In 2010, while its share was already caving in, Nokia poured about $3.9 billion into mobile R&D, roughly triple the average competitor, more than Apple, with about a third of it going straight into Symbian. Nokia was spending more than Apple to lose to Apple, so where did the money go? Into the forks, into porting, into maintaining parallel versions, into bolting a touch interface onto an architecture conceived for a keypad, into holding a memory-optimized 1990s code base upright in a world that no longer had a memory problem. And that is the real lesson, the one that generalizes far past phones. Nokia's failure was not a failure to invest in the future. It was that its architecture made investment stop compounding. Every dollar Apple spent improved one platform for every developer at once. Every dollar Nokia spent had to be spent again per fork, per variant, per device. Same money, same engineers, radically different leverage. An incumbent's architecture quietly sets the exchange rate between effort and progress, and Nokia's rate had gone bad years before anyone noticed the revenue. If that reframing is useful, subscribe. This channel takes apart one dead company a week, and the answer is almost always in the architecture rather than the boardroom. Now here is where a slow problem became a very fast one. In February 2011, Nokia's new chief executive, Stephen Elop, wrote an internal memo comparing the company to a man on a burning oil platform, choosing between freezing water and the fire. It leaked on February 8th, and 3 days later he announced Nokia was abandoning both Symbian and its Linux successor to build Windows phones with Microsoft. The stock fell about 14% that day. His diagnosis was right. The platform really was burning. But there is a reason companies do not announce the death of the product they still have to sell tomorrow. And it has a name. The Osborne effect. Nokia had just told the world that every phone in its stores ran a dead operating system. Carriers stopped promoting them, developers walked, and sales of the thing paying the bills collapsed while the replacement was still half a year from shelves. Then in June, Nokia shipped the N9 running MeGo, the Linux platform it had just condemned, and reviewers loved it, some calling it the best thing Nokia had ever built. Elop confirmed Nokia would not go back to MeGo even if the N9 sold well. The company had a working answer in its hands and had already promised it away. The rest is arithmetic. Symbian's share of smartphones fell from roughly 2/3 of the market in 2006 to 52% in 2008 to 22% by mid-2011 to about 4% by mid-2012. The Lumia line never found the developer's Windows phone needed. In September 2013, Microsoft agreed to buy Nokia's Devices and Services division for about $7.2 billion. Less than 15 months after the deal closed, Microsoft wrote off $7.6 billion, more than it had paid. Nokia's last Symbian phone, the 808 PureView, shipped in 2012 with a camera nobody else could match, running an operating system nobody would write for. So what actually killed Nokia? Not arrogance and not blindness. The labs saw it. The prototypes existed. The money was spent. Nokia died because it had optimized its foundation brilliantly and correctly for a constraint that expired. Symbian was the right operating system for 1998, tiny, tough, and frugal with memory. Every decision that made it excellent at scarcity made it hostile to developers, and when memory stopped being scarce, developers turned out to be the only resource that mattered. By then, the architecture could not be renegotiated because it was no longer just code. It was the forks, the tooling, the org chart, and a decade of habits. That is the uncomfortable pattern. The The deepest technical decisions are the ones that look most obviously correct when you make them, and they stay load-bearing long after the reason for them is gone. Nokia did not lose because it bet wrong. It lost because it bet right in 1998, and the world moved the goalposts while it was winning. Nokia had the future in its own labs and could not ship it. Another company had it in its hands and laughed at it. BlackBerry owned half of America's smartphones and around $80 billion in value, and its founder looked at the iPhone, called the keyboard the future, and dismissed it as a toy. If you think spending Triple Apple's research budget to lose was painful, wait until you see the $80 billion mistake that began with a man being perfectly rational. That story is on the channel now, and the link is on screen.